The interpreter's hand was trembling when he passed the folded note across the mahogany table. Not because of what was written on it, because of who had asked him to write it, and where, and at what hour. Cardinal Pietro Parolin had already read it once, seated in the second-floor reception room of the Apostolic Palace at 11 minutes past 7 on the morning of June the 17th, 2026. He set it down on the edge of the table. He folded his hands. He said nothing for a long time. Then, very quietly, he picked up the telephone on his left. By 9 o'clock that morning, the Vatican Secretariat of State had placed calls to 3 embassies. By noon, the Al-Azhar Grand Imam's office in Cairo had confirmed it would not be issuing a statement before 6 o'clock. By the time the evening call to prayer echoed across the rooftops of Rome, the most unexpected papal visit in modern church history was already in motion. And no one who had been in that room at 11 minutes past 7 was saying a word about what had actually been proposed. Before the story continues, if what you just heard is already pulling you in, please take a moment to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. Every like, every subscription, and every comment keeps stories like this one alive. Now back to what happened inside the Vatican. It had begun, as so many of the most consequential decisions of this pontificate have begun, not in Rome at all, but in a conversation that was never meant to be reported. On the afternoon of June 12, 2026, Pope Leo XIV received a delegation of 5 scholars from the World Muslim League at the Domus Sancti Marthi, the modest Vatican guest house where he had chosen to live rather than the Apostolic Palace, a preference that still faintly unsettled the more protocol-conscious members of the Curia. The meeting had been scheduled for 45 minutes. It lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. No recording was made, no joint statement was released afterward. The Vatican Press Office confirmed the meeting in a single paragraph that named no topics discussed and offered no characterization of the atmosphere. What happened inside that room, according to 3 separate people familiar with the conversation, was something that had not happened in any formal Vatican dialogue with Islam for longer than most of the participants had been alive. Pope Leo XIV, Robert Francis Prevost, the Augustinian, prior from Chicago who had been elevated to the papacy in May of 2025 as the Church's first American pontiff, had made a request. He had asked whether it would be possible, on a proposed pastoral visit to Istanbul, to pray inside the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, not in its courtyard, not in its gardens, inside, at the hour of prayer, facing Mecca. To understand why those words detonated the way they did, why the note that Cardinal Parolin received 5 days later at 11 minutes past 7 in the morning made the interpreter's hand tremble. You need to understand what decades of careful, cautious, often painful interfaith dialogue had built, and what it had always, until that moment, declined to cross. The Second Vatican Council's declaration Nostra Aetate, issued in 1965, had fundamentally reordered the Catholic Church's relationship to the non-Christian world. It acknowledged the spiritual traditions of Islam with language that had seemed revolutionary at the time. The Council recognised that Muslims adore the one merciful God, that they revere Jesus as a prophet, that they honour Mary. It called for sincere efforts toward mutual understanding. It said nothing about shared prayer. It said nothing about what a pope might one day do inside a mosque, at the hour when the muezzin called. That question had never been asked in Nostra Aetate, and in the 60 years that followed, no one had pressed it to a formal answer, because no one had quite dared. St. John Paul II had visited the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus in May of 2001, the first pope ever to enter a mosque. He had stood at the tomb of John the Baptist, venerated by both faiths, and offered a prayer for peace. He had not prayed the Islamic prayer. He had been present in an Islamic space, and that alone had been seismic. Benedict XVI had visited the Blue Mosque in Istanbul in 2006, in what was described, with exquisite diplomatic care, as a moment of private recollection. He had stood beside the Grand Mufti, had oriented himself toward Mecca, and had been photographed in a posture that looked, to many observers, very much like prayer, though the Vatican was careful never to use that word in its official account of the visit. Francis had returned to Istanbul, had stood again in the Blue Mosque, and had again navigated the same razor's edge, being present without the act being formally named, praying without it being called prayer. Each visit had been reported as unprecedented. Each visit had produced its own small firestorm. None of them had done what Pope Leo XIV was now, according to those 3 people familiar with his conversation with the World Muslim League delegation, proposing to do. He was not proposing to visit a mosque and offer a moment of silent reflection. He was proposing to enter, to stand in the congregation's space and to pray, together, with the congregation, at the time of prayer. The news reached Cardinal Gerhard Müller at his apartment near the Campo de' Fiori on the morning of June 15th, 2 days before Cardinal Parolin received his note. Müller, the German theologian who had served as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith under Benedict XVI, who had been one of the 4 cardinals to submit the famous dubia challenging Francis in 2016, and who had made no secret of his unease with several of Leo XIV's early doctrinal signals, received the information not from any official Vatican channel, but from a journalist at a German Catholic weekly who called him for comment. According to a person present in the apartment that morning, Müller listened to the full question before responding. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, that if what had been described was accurate, it would require the most serious theological examination the Holy See had undertaken in a generation. He said he was not prepared to comment further until he had seen something in writing from the Secretariat of State. He said he would be placing a call to Rome within the hour. He placed it in 20 minutes. By noon on June 15th, a draft letter bearing Müller's name and the signatures of 4 other senior cardinals, including Cardinal Raymond Burke of the United States, who had been living in voluntary residence at a Roman monastery since his public dispute with Francis over fiducia supplicans, was already being circulated among a small group of canonists and theologians working in the traditionalist wing of the Church. The letter did not call for the visit to be cancelled. It called for a formal theological clarification before any announcement was made. It asked, in the measured language of canon law, whether a pope's participation in Islamic prayer could be squared with the Church's ancient teaching that Christian prayer and Islamic prayer, however much they might speak of the same God, were not the same act, addressed to the same person, in the same faith. That letter never reached the public. What reached the public 2 days later was a brief statement from the Vatican Press Office confirming that Pope Leo XIV had accepted an invitation to visit Istanbul in the 3rd week of June, that his schedule would include a visit to the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, a meeting with Turkish President Erdogan, and, in a single subordinate clause that would set the Catholic world on fire, a stop at the Sultan Ahmed Mosque. The statement used no verbs that could be called prayer. It said the Pope would visit. It said the visit was expected to include a moment of shared reflection on peace. It said further details would be released in the coming days. It was enough. Among the progressive wing of the Catholic Church, the reaction in the first hours was something close to disbelief. The warm, overwhelmed disbelief of people who had spent decades arguing for exactly this kind of gesture and had been told in 100 different ways by 100 different curial officials that it was impossible, imprudent, or simply not the moment. Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, the Luxembourgish Jesuit, who had been one of Leo XIV's most visible early supporters in the College of Cardinals, was reached by a reporter from the National Catholic Reporter at approximately 3 p.m. Rome time. He said that what the Pope was doing was not merely a pastoral visit. He said it was a theological statement in itself. He said the Church had always taught that God's grace could not be confined by human walls, and that a Pope choosing to stand with his Muslim brothers and sisters at the hour of prayer was a living expression of that teaching. Hollerich's words were published within the hour. They were shared several 100,000 times by nightfall. For approximately 6 hours, the progressive side of Catholic social media celebrated. Then Cardinal Müller issued his own statement at 9:23 in the evening Rome time through a German-language Catholic news agency, and the landscape shifted entirely. Müller's statement was 3 paragraphs long. In the first, he reaffirmed his personal respect for Islam and his commitment to the principles of Nostra Aetate. In the second, he noted that there was an essential distinction, theologically essential, historically established, irreducible, between the Christian act of prayer, which was directed to a Trinitarian God, and made possible only through the mediation of Jesus Christ, and the Islamic act of prayer, which explicitly rejected Trinitarian theology as a distortion of monotheism. He said that to participate in Islamic prayer was not to express the same truth in different cultural language. It was, on the Muslim side's own insistence, to express a different truth. In the third paragraph, he asked whether anyone, including the Holy Father himself, had considered what it meant for the Vicar of Christ to stand in a posture of Islamic salah, in a mosque, before a congregation whose faith required them to believe that the Christian understanding of Jesus was fundamentally mistaken. He did not say it was wrong. He asked whether anyone had thought it through. The progressive celebration collapsed within 20 minutes of the statement's publication. What replaced it was not silence, it was open warfare. In Germany, the Bishops' Conference released a statement supporting the Pope's decision and describing it as consistent with the spirit of the Second Vatican Council, consistent with Nostra Aetate, and consistent with Leo XIV's vision of a church that walks alongside humanity rather than above it. In Poland, the Bishops' Conference released a statement in the same 2-hour window that was significantly more guarded, welcoming dialogue with Islam in the warmest possible terms, while noting that the specific nature of this gesture deserved deep reflection before being celebrated as precedent. In the United States, the response split not by bishop but by diocese. Cardinal Robert McElroy of Washington said publicly that he believed the visit was exactly the kind of witness the world needed from the Bishop of Rome. Archbishop Samuel Aquila of Denver said, in a statement that did not name McElroy but quoted extensively from a 2016 document on interreligious prayer, that presence in a place of worship was not the same as participation in its prayer, and that the distinction mattered enormously to the faithful he served. In Brazil, Cardinal Adilo Scherer of São Paulo said he trusted Pope Leo XIV completely and would await the Vatican's formal clarification before forming any opinion on the theological dimensions of the visit. In Turkey, where the visit was scheduled to occur, the Directorate of Religious Affairs, the governmental body that oversees Islam in Turkey, released a statement of welcome so warm and so enthusiastic that it was almost immediately cited by critics of the visit as evidence that the Islamic world, at least, understood exactly what was being proposed. By midnight on June 16th, Catholic social media was not a debate. It was a battle. The word syncretism was appearing in posts faster than any fact-checking could follow it. The word witness was appearing in different posts at exactly the same pace. Two communities reading the same 3 sentences from the Vatican press office had concluded opposite things, and both were certain they were right. That was the morning Cardinal Parolin received his note. It was on the morning of June 17th, according to a senior curial official speaking on condition of anonymity, that the most significant internal meeting of Leo XIV's pontificate, to that point, took place in a private room on the 3rd floor of the Apostolic Palace that is not used for official audiences and does not appear on any public schedule. Cardinal Parolin was present. The prefect of the dicastery for promoting Christian unity, Cardinal Kurt Koch, was present. A theologian from the Augustinian order, the Pope's own order, whose name the official declined to share, was present. And Pope Leo XIV himself was present, seated at a table that held only a copy of Nostra Aetate, a glass of water, and a single yellow legal pad, on which nothing was yet written. The meeting lasted an hour and 40 minutes. No notes were taken by anyone except the Pope himself. A source with knowledge of what was discussed, described only as someone who had been briefed by one of the participants, said that the theologians present had raised every objection that Müller had raised in his statement, and several that Müller had not. They had walked the Pope through the precise liturgical structure of the Islamic Salat al-Fajr, the dawn prayer, and asked him to consider, step by step, whether each element of it was one he could participate in good conscience. They had reminded him that the Shahada, the declaration of Islamic faith, was itself a repudiation of the Trinity. They had asked what message it would send to every Catholic bishop who was simultaneously trying to explain to their congregations why the Church's prayer and Islam's prayer, however mutually respectful, were not interchangeable acts addressed to an identical God. The Pope listened to all of it. He asked questions. He wrote on the yellow legal pad. At the end of the meeting, according to the source, he set down his pen and said one sentence. He said it quietly, as though he was speaking as much to himself as to the room. The source paused before recounting it. He said the Pope had looked up from the legal pad and said, "If I cannot stand where the suffering stand, I cannot speak for the Christ who did." Cardinal Koch left the 3rd floor room and walked directly to his own offices on the 2nd floor. He did not stop to speak with his secretary. His expression, a colleague who passed him in the corridor would later tell a reporter, was the expression of a man trying to solve an equation that did not yet have a solution. What Pope Leo XIV had decided in that room was not yet known beyond its 4 walls. But something had been decided. That much was clear to everyone who had been in the building that morning. There is a question that runs beneath everything that happened on the 3rd floor of the Apostolic Palace on June 17th, 2026. A question that no curial document had ever fully answered, that no council had ever been bold enough to put precisely, that every pope since the Second Vatican Council had navigated by feel and instinct and diplomatic evasion. The question is not whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God. Theologians have debated that for centuries and will debate it for centuries more. The question is what it means for a human being who holds the highest office in the Christian world to stand physically in the posture of Islamic prayer, in a space designed for Islamic worship, at the hour when Islam calls its faithful to remember what they believe, not to observe, not to witness from the side, to stand with. That is the question that Muller had raised with his 3 careful paragraphs, and that the theologians on the 3rd floor had raised in a different register, and that millions of Catholics on social media had raised in a different register still. It is also the question that Robert Francis Prevost, born in Chicago in 1955, ordained an Augustinian priest in 1982, assigned to mission work in Peru for much of his adult ministry, had been asking in his own way for his entire priestly life. Those who had known him in Peru described a man who had an almost physical discomfort, with boundaries drawn at the edge of his own tradition. Not because he doubted the tradition, because he believed the tradition was large enough to do things the tradition had not yet done. Because he believed that the Christ who sat with lepers and tax collectors and Samaritans had not drawn the boundaries where the institution had drawn them, and that the institution needed, occasionally, to be reminded of that. Late on the evening of June 17th, 2026, Pope Leo XIV returned to his private chapel at the Domus Sanctae Marthae, as he did every night before the rest of the house had fully gone to sleep. The chapel is small and plain in the way that the domus itself is small and plain. Stone walls, a wooden kneeler worn smooth by use, a crucifix above the altar that had belonged, according to the house's records, to a Vatican guest master who had died in 1962. The hour was past 11. A source close to his personal household said that on the night of June 17th, the Pope remained in the chapel well past midnight, considerably longer than his usual 30 to 40 minutes. The aide who waited outside, a young Augustinian brother assigned to the household, said afterward that the chapel was silent the whole time. When the Pope finally rose and turned out the small light over the kneeler, he said something quietly before he stepped into the corridor. Said it in the tone of a man finishing a prayer he had been saying in one form or another for a very long time. The aide heard him say, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Lord, let them see you, not me." By the morning of June 18th, the world was still arguing. Muller had agreed to a television interview with a German broadcaster scheduled for June 19th, and the interview request from a Rome correspondent for Al Jazeera to the Vatican Press Office remained, as of that morning, unanswered. In the Secretariat of State, a document was being prepared, its precise nature and contents not yet confirmed by any official source. The delegations in Istanbul had been informed that a final schedule for the papal visit would be transmitted no later than June 20th. Inside the Apostolic Palace, 3 floors above the manicured Vatican Gardens, where the morning light was already moving across the ancient stones, something had already been set in motion that would not be stopped by a letter, or a statement, or a television interview, or a press officer's careful silence. What Pope Leo XIV would say when he stood inside the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, whether he would stand at all, and in what posture, and with what words before and after, was not yet known to anyone outside the room on the 3rd floor where a yellow legal pad sat with writing on it that no one else had seen. But something had been decided, that much was certain.